So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at all the different regions of China. China really is divided into 5 major regions. We've already talked about the fact that we have inner and outer China, or China proper, and the periphery of China. Inner China is broken up into 3 different regions. In the northeast, we have the northeastern plain, also sometimes referred to by outsiders as Manchuria. Over here to the west of the Yellow Sea, we have the North China Plain. And then this southeastern portion is a part of China that we call the Southern Hills. Out here in western China, we have in the southwest portion, Tibet, which is mostly populated by Tibetans who practice Tibetan Buddhism or Vajrayana Buddhism. And in the northwest, we have a lot of dry climates. This is where China's Muslim population lives, particularly in the province of Xinjiang. And I love this map because it doesn't just give you all the different climate zones of China. It also gives you a feel for what different parts of China actually feel like. So here's between the Northeast Plain, or Manchuria, and the North China Plain. We have an area that feels kind of like western Nebraska, and just down here where it says Kansas in this humid continental area, it's really a lot more like the climate we have over here in eastern Nebraska. The Northeast Plain has mostly a warm summer continental climate. It did used to be rather swampy, but development of the land over the last century really has turned it into great farming. And this was the homeland of the last people who actually conquered China, a group of people called the Manchus. They were removed from China's government at the beginning of the 1900s, just as the Chinese were trying to get all foreigners out. They were trying to push out the Europeans and eventually the Japanese as well. Though in the modern day, Manchuria, the largest population there, or the largest population of what China now calls the Northeast Plain, are Han. You do need to be able to recognize different cities. This is the city of Dalian. And, it's easy to recognize with the big soccer ball and Ferris wheel here on the outskirts of town. But I want to emphasize, this is just a minor Chinese city, but look at the size of that thing. Chinese cities are massive. The North China Plain is a combination of hot continental summer climates in the northern portion of it, and the southern half of it has a humid subtropical climate. The big thing here is that it's pretty darn warm. It's similar to the climate we have here in eastern Nebraska, at least in the northern portion of the North China Plain, but they don't get anywhere near as cold as we do during the winter. And so the North China Plain really is a fantastic place to grow things. And it's kind of wild to look at it because here's some farmland in the North China Plain. If I didn't know better, if somebody had just told me that was Nebraska, I probably would have believed them. The North China Plain is the original home of the Han Chinese people. The Han Chinese people started in the North China Plain if you go back 3,500 years. And it is the broadest area of urban settlement in China. Most of the North China Plain is covered in city. Obviously, not all of it, but a huge portion of it. It also has the most fertile soil in China, and for one major reason. The Yellow River flows through the North China Plain. The Yellow River gets its name from the fact that it often is yellow. It's yellow because it picks up a type of soil that we call loess. Loess is this very silty sediment. It's finer than sand, but it's coarser than clay, which makes it great for growing things because it holds on to water, but it still drains decently. Loess usually has a yellow color, and it erodes really easily. So there is a portion of China called the Loess Plateau, and it's right here in the hook of the Yellow River. So the Yellow River does make its way through and around the Loess Plateau, and it picks up a lot of this loess that, again, erodes very easily. Loess, because of its organic content and because of its ability to hold moisture as well as drain decently, is the reason why the North China Plain is so fertile. The Yellow River picks up loess in the Loess Plateau and deposits it on the North China Plain. This is why often the Yellow River is called the cradle of Chinese civilization. Though it's not all great things that come with the Yellow River. The Yellow River starts way up in the Tibetan Plateau, starts way high up, about 3 miles high. And as it winds its way down through the Loess Plateau, it's moving quite quickly, so it picks up all of this Loess silt all of this somewhat fine soil. And the Yellow River carries a lot of this silt away every year. Just to give you an idea as to how much the Yellow River picks up in the lowest plateau. At the mouth of the river, when it makes its way out into the Bohai Sea, it discharges around 1.6 billion tons of sediment every year. And so this portion of the Bohai Sea just keeps getting filled up with more and more loess and other things that the Yellow River picks up. Just to give you an idea as to how much that is, the Mississippi here in the United States, the mighty Mississippi, it averages around 150 million tons every year. Less than 10% of what the Yellow River picks up. And that's just what the Yellow River puts out into the Bohai Sea. Because the Yellow River, once it hits the North China Plain, it slows down rapidly. Remember, it's just cruising on down from that Tibetan plateau through the lowest plateau, high speeds, and then it gets to this plain and everything slows down. Now think of this. You have this sediment, this lowest that's picking up, and it's churned up in the river. It's suspended in the water because the water's always moving. And it's just heading downhill until it gets to that plain. And when it gets to that plain, everything slows down, the water calms down, and that lowest starts to settle. And when that lowest starts to settle down to the bottom of the riverbed starts to rise. There's not as much room, just, if you get extra rain or extra ice melt that year. The river doesn't have the ability to hold it all, or at least the river banks don't have the ability. And so the Yellow River has regularly flooded throughout China's history. And its floods have been catastrophic. Looking over here on this upper left-hand map, you can see that the Yellow River, in its major floods, has often changed course entirely. So it has spent part of its existence flowing south of the Shandong Peninsula, and in its current state, it flows north of it. This, of course, has deposited loess all over the North China Plain, but it has also destroyed many lives. There haven't been any major catastrophes recently. The most notable floods of the Yellow River in the modern day were in 1887, when a flood killed nearly 2 million people, and then again in 1932, when a flooding of the Yellow River killed nearly 4 million people. Remember, the North China Plain is the most densely populated portion of China, and so all these people living within the floodplain of the Yellow River are at risk. It's a significant challenge for the Chinese government to keep everybody safe. And the way the Chinese government has learned to deal with it, not just in the modern era underneath the Communist Party, but throughout the centuries, is to build dams all along the river that collect the sediment before it gets down to the North China Plain, as well as to build levees and dikes, sides on the side of the river, that can handle any extra waters. Not too far from the Yellow River is China's capital city, Beijing. This is the largest city in the North China Plain, though not the largest city in China. It has about 22.5 million people. And it's always shocking me to look at just these never-ending seas of skyscrapers, but it's also home to some outstanding architecture. So if you ever see this kind of M-shaped building over here, or you see that pod-shaped building up there, you know that you're in Beijing. And remember, you need to be able to recognize cities. And so pay attention to landmarks. Pay attention to things that will allow you to be like, that's Beijing. The Temple of Heaven is another landmark of Beijing that you should be able to recognize. China has this concept of heaven that is really kind of like the whole cosmos. It's not exactly a specific god as much as it is the concept of the divine that rules over everything. And the Chinese have always believed that the government of China holds something called the mandate of heaven, that the cosmos has decided these are the people that should be in charge. And so past emperors have always wanted to make sure that heaven's on their side. They built the Temple of Heaven 500 years ago so that they could actually make sacrifices to this cosmic deity. The Forbidden City used to be the home of Chinese emperors. And you can see here this very common traditional architecture of East Asia. This is common in China, the Koreas, and in Japan. These upturned corners on the sides of roofs. Now all these pictures paint a really idyllic version of Beijing, but in this country that has been rapidly developing over the last 3 or 4 decades, it's also produced quite a bit of pollution. The air in Beijing quite often is not really breathable. It's certainly not healthy. And this is all just coming from factories, cars that people are now starting to use more often. You might have heard before that China produces even more pollution than the United States. This is true, though it should be noted that per person, remember they have about 4 times the population of us, per person, we are still the most polluting country in the world. Also, in the North China Plain, we have the Great Wall of China. Historically, China has been pretty protected from the outside world. Down to the south here with Southeast Asia, there are some pretty dense forests that you really can't move an army through very easily. Over here, we have the really high Tibetan Plateau bordered by the Himalayan mountains. You're not getting an army over that. And then in the northwest, we have the Taklamakan Desert and the Gobi Desert. Both areas that there are ways through. Merchants have been making their way through there for centuries, really for millennia. But this is not a good way to invade. The only way China has consistently been invaded is from the northeast. And so Chinese emperors for the last 2,200 years have been building these big earthen walls, these big dirt walls that cover the northeast to keep out a lot of the invaders that would be coming through. Invaders that would include folks like the Manchus and before them the Mongols. But 500 years ago, after the Chinese had kicked out the Mongols, who had conquered them a couple hundred years before that, 500 years ago, their response to that was to build a new wall, not dirt, but brick and mortar. Remember, this is the beginning of China closing themselves off from the outside world, not allowing outsiders in, and not allowing Chinese to go out and come back. And it is during this time that they literally walled themselves off, because the Great Wall is just an artificial completion of all these other natural barriers that go around China. All right, that's the North China Plain. You need to know it well. Let's go ahead and now move on to the southern portion of Inner China, the Southern Hills. This is really a pretty broad name for a diverse region. The southern portion of China, the Southern Hills, the southeast portion, is possibly the most diverse portion of China. It's where most of the non-Mandarin Sinitic languages are spoken. Remember, all these other Chinese languages that are not Mandarin, they're really spoken down here in the Southern Hills. It has the greatest diversity of minority people. It's also the main area of rice cultivation in China. You know, most areas are not that well suited to rice production. You need a lot of water, and you need a whole lot of heat year-round. So northern China grows things more like millet and wheat. It's southern China where rice is a crucial crop. And the result of this in southern China has been these beautifully carved hills, or what we call terraced hills or terraced mountains. Rice has to be grown on paddies. It has to be grown on these flat areas that can be flooded and leave the water flooded on top of them. And so these hills, if they're going to grow anything on them, if we're going to grow rice on them, they have to get this terracing. And every time I look at them, I always just think of like if you were a giant and you can go up and just go like zzz, that type of like vibration across something. There's something that's just texturally very awesome about those things. You do need to be able to recognize terraced mountainsides or terraced hills that are used as rice paddies. Now, like I said, Southern Hills are the part of China that has the most diversity. It actually has an autonomous region. A group of non-Han Chinese people, folks called the Zhuang people. Say that out loud. Zhuang. The Zhuang people have lived in this region going back over 1,000 years. And so when the communist government took over, they set out this portion of China as an autonomous region where the Zhuang people can maintain their own culture, where they can still essentially rule themselves, though again they did have and still do have a Han governor that keeps an eye on all of them. So you can see the Chinese government has a lot of vested interest in the Han people. Autonomous regions don't get Zhuang governors or Mongolian governors. They get Han governors. And really, if I ever get a chance to visit China, Guanxi is probably the first place I want to go, partially because of these amazing karst mounds that they have. These are bits of limestone that have been worn down over the years. creating these kind of Lord of the Rings type of naturescapes. And because this is a productive region and this is a beautiful region, a lot of Han people have been moving there. As a matter of fact, the Zhuang people are no longer the majority of Guanxi Autonomous Region. Han are now the majority there, though it still gets to maintain its autonomous region status. These are just other images of the karst mounds. And again, this just makes me think like hobbits are out there playing in it. Here's one part of those karst mounds that have actually been worn all the way down to just the stone. And this is called the Stone Forest. It's rumored to be a haunted place. Another really cool place I want to visit someday. Now, on the border between inner China and outer China, we do have one more population center, Sichuan Basin. It's the furthest west you can go in southern China, in that southern portion of China. Sichuan Basin is just about as densely populated as the North China Plain. And to give you an idea as to how packed Sichuan Basin is, Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan province, this is what the streets of Chengdu look like when it's not the tourist season. Though I want to emphasize, no matter where we are in China, even in these heavily populated areas, they still do have to grow food. And the Sichuan Basin, along with the rest of the southern hills, is a humid subtropical region. It does have a temperate, humid subtropical climate, which means lots of moisture, lots of rain, and lots of heat year-round. The southern hills also include both of the special administrative regions of China. Remember, these are the two places that used to be colonies that were given back. Both are on the southeast coast of China. We have Macau that used to be part of the Portuguese Empire that now has been given back to China, though it still gets to maintain its democratic traditions and its capitalism, and many of the people there speak Portuguese. And then we have Hong Kong. Hong Kong had belonged to Britain ever since the mid-1800s, and in 1898, Britain forced China to sign a 99-year-long lease on Hong Kong so they could maintain Hong Kong as one of their hubs in East Asia. Hong Kong is both an island and it's a harbor that's over on the mainland right there on the South China Sea. And in 1997, the British followed through with the lease and they gave it back to China. But when they gave it back to China, there was a lot of panic. Now imagine this. This is a city where a lot of the people speak English, even though most of them are still Han. But these are people that were accustomed to voting on their city council, voting on their government. These were people that were accustomed to private property. And now they're going to get handed over to a communist authoritarian state. So when Britain gave back Hong Kong to China, they negotiated certain rights. And those basic rights were that Hong Kong would still get to maintain its own laws. It could still handle its own foreign trade. They could still vote in their own city council, though the system that was set up wasn't totally democratic, and the chief executive of Hong Kong had to be approved of by China, had to be approved of by Beijing. And they were supposed to have their own police force. China was not supposed to be allowed to send in any police to do things like arrest people who spoke out against the government. The people of Hong Kong were still supposed to have free speech. At least for 50 years. The agreement was that for the next 50 years, Hong Kong still gets to keep all these rights, and they can work out all how it would become part of China. Now, the official name of this was Two Systems, One Country. This agreement has essentially been broken, and we are going to be looking at that later on. So I'm not going to get too deep into this, but be aware of the fact that Hong Kong has a long history of democracy, of free speech, of human rights, of private property, of capitalism, and it looks like that might be going away now, and the people of Hong Kong are rightfully frightened. Now, just as the North China Plain has the Yellow River, the southern hills, the southern portion of China, has the Yangtze River. The Yangtze River also starts up in the Tibetan Plateau and makes its way down all the way out. Its mouth is on the East China Sea, right next to Shanghai. And unlike the Yellow River, the Yangtze River does not have the same problems of regular flooding. It doesn't go through any lowest plateau or any other area where it erodes down silt that raises the riverbed. Which is not to say that's not important for irrigation and it doesn't bring down other nutrients with it. It's just to say it does not have the same issues that the Yellow River has. And it also does not bring as much organic matter to grow things in as the Yellow River does. But it does bring down some sediment. As we're going to see here in a little bit, that sediment is important. The Three Gorges Dam is a hydroelectric power station. As a matter of fact, the Three Gorges Dam, just by size, is the largest power station in the world. The creation of this was a monumental undertaking, and it was also a rather destructive undertaking. Ancient villages had to be evacuated because this whole area behind the dam, of course, was flooded when it was built. And it's been a project that has been difficult for the Chinese government to perfect, but it has created a ton of electricity that doesn't produce the type of smog that we're seeing in places like Beijing. Remember how I said the Yangtze River does produce some sediment and it is important? Well, the Three Gorges Dam is now holding back a whole lot of that sediment, and that can create a problem, particularly for cities like Shanghai. Shanghai is right there on the east coast of China, with the Yangtze River passing right by it. Now, the Yangtze River, as it passes by Shanghai, of course, erodes some of the ground around Shanghai. And without more sediment to fill in that ground that's being eroded away, well, things can get a little dicey in the long run. This is not a significant issue. It's just a reminder that anytime we have human-environment interaction, there are many other consequences that we can't always be prepared for. Shanghai is easily recognized by some of its landmarks, including this funky building with all of the balls and the tall tower. And this great building over here that I once heard a student refer to as God's bottle opener. So those are the three different regions of inner China: the Northeast Plain, the North China Plain, and the Southern Hills. You need to know features of them. You need to be able to recognize things like the karst mountains in the Southern Hills, the stone forest, Shanghai. You need to know the climates of each of those regions. And of course, you need to understand the governmental makeup that is China as a whole, that is also things like the autonomous regions and the special administrative regions. We're going to go ahead and quickly shift over to the western portion of China, to the periphery of China. I want to remind you that 90% of China's population lives in the eastern third, and maybe a little more, the eastern 40% of its land. And this is also where most Han Chinese live. Han culture originated in the North China Plain, and as the Han people conquered and emigrated both south and to the north, some of the tribes they conquered over the last 3,000 years were what we called Sinicized. You need to know this term. A group of people who have been Sinicized are people that have become Chinese, that over the ages they have just adopted Chinese language, Chinese culture. They use things like chopsticks like Chinese people do. They use Chinese characters. They identify completely as Chinese. But not everybody the Chinese conquered assimilated into that culture. The Zhuang people are one example of that. The Mosuo people are another example. I always like talking about the Mosuo because this is a group of people that have a matriarchal society. The women of the Mosuo culture own everything. They own the businesses. They do most of the work. The men in the culture fulfill a place very similar to women in 1950s America. They're important for having kids, and the women enjoy their company, but the men don't really have any power. People like the Mosuo or the Zhuang are part of the 55 ethnic minority groups that the Chinese government officially recognizes. There are 55 ethnic minorities that the Chinese government has said they're allowed to keep their culture, they're allowed to keep their practices, even if they go against some of the other customs or even some of the laws that the Han people practice in China. So this expansion has been going on for 3,000 years, with some groups Sinicizing and some maintaining their identity, but it hasn't really stopped. In the modern day, the Communist Party has made a concerted effort to get Han Chinese to move west. The goal of getting Han Chinese to move west is multiple-fold. One, as we saw, things are pretty packed in eastern China, and there's a lot of land out west to be settled. As you might have noticed, there's a lot of similarities between the United States and China. Similar size of the countries, not even totally different shapes of the countries, but this idea of a Han population or a Chinese population that is encouraged to move west, very similar to the pioneers in our country. And they're encouraged in similar fashions. They're offered cheap or free land. They are offered good jobs. They're offered tax breaks in order to migrate out to the West. But there are already people living in the West. There are already minority groups that live out there. Kind of like what happened here in the late 1800s. So outer China, or the Western Periphery, is really divided up into two sections, and they're primarily based on the geography/climate. We have Tibet in the south, and that also sometimes includes Shanghai. This is all part of the Tibetan Plateau that has a highland climate. It does not get a whole lot of precipitation, but it is pretty darn cold there. There is not a lot of good farmland in Tibet. The Tibetan people have for a long time been pretty impoverished. On the northern portion of outer China, or this Western Periphery, we primarily have desert and steppe climates. These desert and steppe climates include Inner Mongolia, where the majority of the population are Mongols, also an autonomous region where they get to maintain their own laws, but they do have a Han governor. The autonomous region of Ningxia. Ningxia is the home of a group of people called the Hui Chinese. The Hui Chinese are descendants of Central Asian Muslims who settled down in China. They still practice Islam to this day, but they have been somewhat Sinicized. They are still part of China's culture and played a rather important role in China's culture over the last few centuries. All of this right here is the Gobi Desert. And you might remember from our video, the Gobi Desert is what we call a cold desert. It's still plenty hot during the summer, but in the winter, it is incredibly cold. And of course gets almost no precipitation. And then we have Xinjiang. This is the home of a group of people called the Uyghur Turks. These are Turkish people, just like the rest of Central Asia. So we're going to see later on, Central Asia is primarily populated by Turkish people all along here. And if we lived in a just world, Xinjiang would just be part of Central Asia. But it is owned by China, and the Uyghur Turks have experienced incredible brutality and oppression at the hands of the Han Chinese Communist government. We are going to be looking very closely at that. Xinjiang includes steppe grasslands as well as the Taklamakan Desert. So when you think of outer China, you should either be thinking of the highlands of the Tibetan Plateau in the south, or the deserts and steppes in the northern portion of the Western Periphery. Know the climates, know the different type of governments. Be very aware of inner China, or China proper, and outer China, or the Western Periphery. Inner China is where most Han people live. It's densely populated. It's the richest part of China. It's where all the advances are taking place right now in China. It's the best educated part of China. The Western Periphery is a part that is essentially being colonized, both in Tibet and in Xinjiang. As we're going to see, while Tibet had a long history of trying to resist this Han incursion, that has settled down quite a bit. Things have not settled down in Xinjiang. More on that in some of the videos we're going to be watching from different news sources.